Hi, I'm Brett Budak, and today we're going to be talking about Pinus densa, or South Florida slash pine, which is one of the less well-known but more common pines of Central and South Florida. So we say less well-known for Pinus densa, or South Florida slash pine, because it's a relatively newly used name, and it used to be considered a variety of Pinus elliottii, or North Florida slash pine. Something you'll notice about this tree, it shares a lot of features with Pinus elliottii, or North Florida slash pine. It has the broadly plated bark, so nice furrows and then with nice flat plates in between. It's very flaky, and then as the bark flakes off, it reveals this kind of a richer brown color, which quickly fades to almost like a pale tan and then eventually to silvery. So that is a feature that distinguishes it, so Pinus densa, or South Florida slash pine, and North Florida slash pine, Pinus elliottii, from Pinus plustris, or longleaf pine. So this is a feature that's shared between this species, Pinus densa, and the species from North Florida, Pinus elliottii, or North Florida slash pine. So we have the bark, which is distinctive, comparing it to longleaf pine. But if you look up into the crown, the clusters of needles at the ends of these branches are composed of very long needles, very much like longleaf pine. And what's convenient about that is one of the more recent phylogenies that looked at the genetic relationships in this group showed that this species, Pinus densa, or South Florida slash pine, is more closely related to longleaf, or Pinus plustris, than it is to Pinus elliottii, or North Florida slash pine. So here are two bundles of needles from the South Florida slash pine, or Pinus densa. They look long, almost like a longleaf, and these are intermediate in length between Pinus elliottii, or North Florida slash pine, and Pinus plustris, but you'll notice you got a nice abbreviated bundle sheath and needles, mostly in pairs of two. On this species, you'll occasionally find some bundles that have 3 needles in them, but on the average, you're going to find mostly 2, just like with North Florida slash pine. Another feature of both Pinus densa and Pinus elliottii, both of our slash pines, that distinguish them from longleaf, is you'll notice that the needle itself has a nice little canoe-like channel in between the ridges of the needle, whereas on a longleaf there would be a raised ridge running down the middle. So you'll notice with this Pinus densa, or South Florida slash pine, that the outline of the crown is composed of lots of overlapping clusters of needles. So some people would like to joke and say it almost looks like a head of broccoli at a distance. So the crown of Pinus densa is relatively dense with lots of overlapping needles and not a ton of negative space. When you're underneath it, below the crown, it's not as obvious, but that's a distinguishing feature in aspect from distance. So here we have an example where we kind of have a lucky side-by-side comparison. So we have two pines behind us here. The one on the right with the more continuous solid crown is likely Pinus densa, or elliottii densa, South Florida slash pine. And then the tree to the left with the much shorter, more ascendate needles and the more open crown is Pinus elliottii var elliottii, or just elliottii, the North Florida slash pine. So features that we look at, which I've already pointed out, is the Pinus densa on the right, visibly, even at this distance, has longer, kind of shaggier needles, so approaching more like what you would expect from longleaf pine, but not quite that dramatic. And notice how every cluster of needles strongly overlaps all of its neighboring clusters of needles, and so you have this almost broccoli-like continuous crown of overlaying needles and branches. And then you compare that to the North Florida slash pine to the left, the Pinus elliottii, and you'll notice that the needles are shorter, they're more ascendate, especially these younger needles. They tend to point more in an upwards direction off of the stem, or off of the branch. And you'll notice there's a lot of negative space in between each cluster of needles. You can look up through that crown and see a lot more blue sky, essentially. So another feature that's unique to Pinus densa, or South Florida slash pine, and something that's helpful to differentiate it from North Florida slash pine, or Pinus elliottii, is it is more fire adapted. It has what we would call a pseudo grass stage. So when it's a young tree, it actually puts some energy into developing a taproot similar to longleaf, but it still does branch. So it has a stout little trunk, and it makes little short branches of really dense needles to protect itself from fire as it builds that taproot. So not as dramatic as the grass stage of a longleaf, where the whole trunk and root start off in the soil, but a little bit more well developed. And that's something that Pinus elliottii, North Florida slash pine, does not do. I won't talk too much about cones, but for especially South Florida slash pine, or Pinus densa, A lot of the keys do mention cone size and also shape, especially the bottom of the cone. In my personal experience, especially in Central and South Florida, it's just not a reliable character, unfortunately. Here's another look at the needles on Pinus densa or South Florida slash pine. Just a closer look at a living specimen. You'll see we've got mostly pairs of 2, but I don't have to look very far to find the occasional bundle that has 3 needles. As always with needle count, you got to be careful, but on average, this also has 2 needles per fascicle. So here's our comparison with the Pinus densa and Pinus palustris again, South Florida slash and longleaf. Looking at the needles again, on the average, the needles of Pinus densa are going to be shorter than those on longleaf, but it's not a reliable character because there is some overlap. But what we can do is we can look in close and we can look at how many needles we have per bundle. On the average, Pinus densa is going to have mostly bundles of 2. And then on the average, Pinus palustris, or longleaf, is going to have mostly bundles of 3, which you can see here. Okay, so here we have a needle comparison. These 3 here are Pinus densa, or South Florida slash pine, and these 3 here are Pinus elliottii, or North Florida slash pine. And so we're going to talk about needle length first. You'll notice that the Pinus densa needles are very much noticeably longer than the Pinus elliottii needles, but many people from other regions would contend that these are extremely short for elliottii and these are extremely long for densa. So that by itself may not be the most useful. Another character that can be a little tricky is looking at the number of needles per fascicle. Both Pinus densa and Pinus elliottii on the average have mostly needles of 2 per bundle. But if you look hard enough on both entities, you will find needles with bundles of 3. So we have an example of that here. Some keys actually rely fairly heavily or lean fairly hard on the number of needles per fascicle, and that's just not really useful, as we can see here. One thing you may walk away from this description of South Florida slash pine or Pinus densa is a little bit of confusion, and that's perfectly okay. Botany is not simple, it's very complicated, and I think pines, as you've all seen today, are a very good example of how you can never just look at one piece of a plant to identify it. In many cases, you have to look at the average of many characters and try to put those all together to come up with an identification. And that's very, very true with pines. Pines are a perfect example of that.